This is Tom Mitro again, and today we're going to talk a little bit about looking at an overview of the legal and agreement structure of the oil and gas sector. And this is important because this affects how the relationships work between the government and the companies, how benefits are shared, and how the resource curse can be impacted. As we indicated, the way that the legal and agreement structure is constructed in a country has an impact on how oil and gas development in that country work. It's influenced by the rules that are made and influenced by the rules about how decisions are made. Anytime that you're looking at the upstream oil and gas sector, there's a few basic questions that need to be answered. Who has the rights to explore and produce? How will the costs, benefits, and risks be shared between the companies? How will the operation be managed? Who's going to make decisions? How will the benefits be taxed or shared with the government as the mineral rights owner? And which laws apply and which don't? Quite often there's exceptions made to laws. And what are the standards that are expected from the companies that operate in terms of complying with the laws both in country and in the international laws and standards? Just trying to address these 4 or 5 basic questions, there are a range, a complex interaction of laws and agreements that apply. So that, for instance, who holds the mineral rights? We'll get into exactly what mineral rights are in a minute, but usually it's the concession award or sometimes through a production sharing agreement. How will those costs be shared amongst those companies that develop those minerals, those oil and gas minerals? How will they be managed? Usually it's a joint operating agreement or JOA, or perhaps a shareholders agreement. And then within that, there are a variety of contracts with the oil field services companies. We talked about those oil field service companies in a previous lecture, what their roles are and how things work with them. How will the benefits be taxed, shared with the government? Once again, a complex interaction of the petroleum tax laws, corporate tax laws, production sharing agreements. Which laws apply and which don't? Quite often there are exceptions from laws for petroleum. It's such a unique activity. So it's a variety of things from the production sharing agreement and the petroleum agreements and petroleum regulations, sorry. What standards are expected? Almost all the laws of the country come into play, along with petroleum laws, the PSA, even international standards. So we'll talk about each of these aspects during this lecture. The first thing to think about is what's usually termed mineral rights. And even the terminology comes from a U.S. English concept that land involves certain rights, the surface rights, but then the rights to what lies beneath the land, typically called the mineral rights, can be associated with the landowner or they can be separated from the land rights. And usually these are exclusive rights. You don't want anyone who can gain access to be battling over who extracts the minerals or the oil and gas, so they're exclusively awarded, usually to private individuals or private companies, is how it's worked in the U.S. And then the company that's been awarded the rights to lease those mineral rights has an obligation to the one who owned the mineral rights. And typically it's in the form of a royalty, which is traditionally 1/8 of the revenues derived. But now this has changed with offshore or federal government lands or state lands, and, where the mineral rights quite often are owned by the state or the federal government because individuals can't own the waterfront. So this has changed a little bit the ownership of mineral rights, especially in the U.S. where we've gotten into Gulf of Mexico or even Native American lands. But now there's some critical differences between how this has worked in the U.S., which has been primarily private landowners leasing to private companies, Internationally, mineral rights are owned by the governments, and usually that's the national government, not by individuals. This is a critical difference which we'll explore in later lectures. Typically, these are leased in much larger tracts. In the U.S., they can be typical areas 64 acres, and whereas internationally they can be quite large, several square miles. And once again, this is another difference that can affect how things are developed and the individual power that's associated with each of these rights. Usually in the U.S., this mineral rights or some sort of lease is how it's described. Internationally, it's usually considered a concession right, so it's a concession granted to the company that would allow it to do certain things, and typically with royalties, just like in the U.S., and some sort of tax on that. But in more recent years, this has evolved into something called the production sharing agreement, which we'll get into talking about a bit later. And it has to do more with rights to the actual oil or gas that's produced rather than an amount of money per se. And often these come along with other requirements. In the U.S., usually these mineral rights may be entailed having to drill a certain number or do something to continue to evaluate the property. Whereas internationally, it's usually a lot more restrictions on those rights requirements. It may require that the government oil company is granted an equity share. There may be certain minimum work obligations, such as having to drill a certain number of wells in order to keep evaluating and developing the property. There may be requirements to use local companies, local employees. There may even, in some cases, be social project obligations, such as having to help local communities, perhaps even do public works. And then lastly, how are these awarded? Well, in many cases, they're a direct negotiation. The government notifies companies that they have these rights they want to lease or to grant, and companies come and apply, and then the government negotiates with companies individually. In other cases, it's an open competitive bidding. So companies submit a bid. Maybe it involves bidding an amount of work that they will do. Maybe it will involve bidding the certain amount of how much production or profit will be shared with the government. In other cases, it can just be an upfront amount of money that's to be paid. So each of these aspects becomes important in evaluating and determining what effect this will have on the country, what effect this will have on how much exploration is done, and what will happen if there is a discovery. This slide is just a map of some of the a few examples. The one to the left is offshore deepwater Nigeria, and the one to the right is a section of Angola, Cabinda, that's between the DRC and the Congo. And you can see on the one on the left, in particular in Nigeria, the different colors represent different companies that have been awarded, or different joint ventures that have been awarded these the rights to explore in these areas. And so it's hard to tell from this, but the coastline is quite large. This is the whole of Nigeria, which is a large country. And so some of these tracts are very large indeed, as you can see, but there are a variety of companies and joint ventures involved. And I think that's the important and critical part to see from these maps. So when these mineral rights are awarded, the most frequently used format is the production sharing contract, sometimes known as a production sharing agreement, the same thing. And what does that typically address? Well, the first thing it does is awards the mineral rights to the company or joint venture group of companies, and it says for how long those rights are awarded. It identifies how spending is controlled, who makes decisions about that spending. And during the exploration, the very risky part of the oil and gas process, how are the risks shared? In many cases, the government doesn't pay for any of those costs, but then if there's a discovery, the government may have the right to acquire an interest at that point. It talks about the work obligations. What number of wells or types of wells have to be drilled, a certain amount of seismic run. The government wants to make sure that this area is being evaluated, that it's not just being sit on by the companies. And it may talk about if there are contracts, who makes the decisions, what criteria has to be used. And then eventually it talks about sharing the benefits. Usually the reason it's called production sharing is that the primary benefits are shared between the government and the oil companies via some sort of production sharing arrangement. It may be based on just a percentage. It may be based on, that percentage may change over time as prices change or production levels change or new discoveries are made. But usually that's the crux of a production sharing agreement, how production is shared. It'll dictate the role of the national oil company. An important part also is reporting and audit requirements. How do you know the companies are doing what they say they've done? How do you know that they are including the right amount of costs? Because part of when you share the production, it's a sharing of production after the recovery of costs. So these are critical pieces. How do you know whether the companies are doing the right thing in terms of hiring or environmental protection? And it establishes compliance. What requirements are imposed specifically by this production sharing agreement for this block, and what requirements are imposed through other laws. And more importantly, even just as importantly, is what kind of exceptions to other laws are granted. Quite often these production sharing agreements will grant an exception to compliance with other laws, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so basically these fiscal terms, the intent of them, this is this combination of how the benefits are shared, usually referred to the fiscal terms. The idea of that is to capture for the government, as the one who owns these minerals, their share of the economic rent. And the concept of economic rent we'll be talking about in the future. But that's basically how productive, how rich, how profitable are these minerals. And usually the more they are deemed to be at the time of award, the more the share goes to the government. So in summary, these production sharing contracts, production sharing agreements cover a wide range of topics. But then additionally, there are certain laws, and these production sharing agreements are agreements. They're just a signed agreement between representatives of the government and representatives of the oil companies. But there are also laws that apply. Generally, there are the normal general laws of the country that may apply to the companies. Specifically, you think about currency regulations. What kind of currencies can they spend? What do they need to do with any currency, any revenues they earn? Can they repatriate it? Do they have to keep it in country? What kind of employment regulations must they follow in terms of hiring and non-discrimination? Importing and exporting. The oil companies import a lot of equipment and personnel, and what laws are they subject to? Port regulations. This may seem like a minor issue, but there are huge amounts of equipment brought into the country, rigs and platforms. In addition, oil is exported or gas is exported from the country. What are the regulations in terms of how they use the ports? Most countries have a variety of taxes, everything from duties on imports, sales tax, stamp duties, withholding tax, VAT. And this can be a complicated intermixing of taxes, and quite often those would apply to the companies. And we'll talk about, in some cases, they receive exemptions from those. Any land rights. Companies have to use the land. They need it for roads, they need it to build plants, they need it to build facilities for employees, warehouses. And what rights do they have to use land in the area? Anti-corruption laws. We'll talk a lot about corruption later on in this course, and that's one of the symptoms of the resource curse. So what do the laws of the country say about payments to officials, illegal activities like that? Environmental laws. Most environmental laws of most countries in the world don't really address oil and gas activities. They are addressing pollution from factories and water runoff, and these are not specialized enough for petroleum, but there are environmental laws. General commercial codes about contract rights, that kind of thing. Companies Acts, these are just, these can become important. Does the international group of companies that operate here have to incorporate in the country? Do they have to file publicly available returns? These relate to disclosure and to the government's ability to understand and evaluate and audit the company's activities. Local content or ownership laws. Many countries in the world require at least a majority of ownership of any activity to be owned by a local person or by local companies. And quite often oil companies struggle to do that just because of the large investments required, the complexity of this. And so these laws can be in conflict with how normally oil and gas activities are carried out. Some countries have laws protecting ethnic minorities, regional balance, if you will, trying to establish regional balance in hiring and in business activities, and then general anti-discrimination laws. So as any company would in any industry in any part of the world, they face this range of laws. But because of the unique nature of petroleum, these laws may not fully address what an oil company's activities are. Consequently, most countries in the world also enact specific petroleum laws. And these may establish standards for operations in terms of just safety. Perhaps they may establish environmental requirements, reporting standards. They may say what they have to do with natural gas. Quite often natural gas cannot be easily and commercially marketed, and so these standards, these laws may say what the companies have to do with that, what permissions they have to get and how it's used. Once again, an audit and inspection framework, the normal general laws may not really easily apply to oil companies because they are so unique and because these companies are operating under production sharing agreements as opposed to laws quite often. And specifically on local content and employment, that's been such a difficult area because of the technical and capital intensive nature of the oil and gas business, that hiring local people and hiring local companies hasn't always progressed. And quite often that's where the real benefit to countries comes in, if they can expand the benefits of oil and gas to beyond just the oil companies and generating revenues to the state treasuries. And then everything from reporting to fines and penalties. Do these fines and penalties, are they large enough under the normal laws to really penalize or discourage certain activities? And so quite often petroleum laws will try to change the nature of those in order to truly discourage activities that are not wanted. Because of this unusual mixture of normal laws, petroleum laws, and the production sharing agreements, and because quite often the governments, through the production sharing agreements, gain a much greater share of profits than they would for a normal company because of this economic rent, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. Because of that much greater payments of taxes and production share and or royalties to the government, quite often the companies are granted certain exemptions or exceptions from normal laws. And this has been a standard throughout the industry for years, although it's increasingly coming under scrutiny as to whether it's appropriate, to whether it really helps the country in which oil and gas is being explored, whether it really helps that country develop or not, or whether it's really just making it easier for the oil and gas companies to do business. And so this balance has to be evaluated. One of the key areas, oil is an international business. As we talked about in a previous lecture, oil and gas is sold in US dollars typically. It's sold on international markets. Many of the contractors for oil and gas are international, so they're paid in usually dollars or euros or something along those lines. And so quite often, oil companies are granted exemptions from the country's normal currency regulations, which would normally say you must conduct business in our country's currency. And anything you earn from abroad has to be brought back and converted into our local currency. Usually the companies are exempted from this. They don't have to return the money they earn from selling the oil back into the country. They are allowed to operate US dollar bank accounts abroad. They are allowed to pay their shareholders in US dollars, and they're allowed to pay quite often their contractors and even their local taxes in the country in US dollars. This is a convenience for those companies, but it is also a major exemption from the laws of the country, and it can make a country a lot more dependent on dollars and be driven more by the exchange rate. We've talked about the Dutch disease a little bit, and this is one of the contributors potentially to that. Imports of goods used in the oil and gas sector are usually granted exemption from duties as long as they're used for oil and gas businesses. And this exemption to the oil companies also is extended typically to their contractors, who can import drilling rigs, equipment, production facilities, even their personal goods of their employees into the country without duties. And they're not required to use local ports or pay port duty, so quite often ports in countries, because they're not supported by duties or port fees or harbor fees, they atrophy because companies build their own ports. So the public ports, public general infrastructure for shipping, tends to deteriorate because they're not getting the funding through this normal or typical mechanism. Taxation. The international oil companies are usually exempted quite often from withholding taxes on dividends they pay to their parents, normal corporate taxes because they're paying special petroleum taxes, value-added tax, stamp duties. Quite often they're exempted from the indigenous ownership requirements. They may not even have to file their tax returns in the local currency. And in many cases, their expatriates may be excluded from taxation. And the foreign contractors of the oil companies sometimes, quite often, are not subjected to in-country taxation either. They may not be required to register in-country, and they may not be required to file tax returns. So once again, this is a means of perhaps potential diversification from the oil company revenues that tends to be denied to the government, and more importantly, it can disadvantage a local contractor trying to compete for this business in the oil sector. And this feeds into the local business and employment regulations. If the international companies that are contracting to the major international oil companies are not being subjected fully to currency restrictions, to import duty restrictions, to a certain amount of tax and registration requirements, then what this can do is give them an intended or unintended advantage compared to local companies. And in some cases, the governments will even protect the international oil companies from local unions. The governments see a value in oil production proceeding without interruption, and so they don't want union activity to be something that interrupts it. So this grand bargain, as I call it, is a result of the complex laws and interaction with the petroleum agreements and the special nature of the petroleum industry. But its original intent was to make oil and gas development flow easier and more quickly and more expeditiously, but quite often it has an unintended consequence of making it more difficult to use local companies and local businesses, and to somehow contribute to currency management problems in the countries. So how are the basic oil and gas operations controlled? Who makes decisions? Who makes determinations about hiring and which projects go ahead and how the work is carried out? Typically throughout the world, including in the US, in the upstream oil and gas sector, it's carried out by a joint venture. And quite often these are, there's a variety of reasons for this. Part of it is just historical, that companies follow tradition of what they've done in the past. But this allows them, if you're in a joint venture and not taking 100% of the risks of exploration or the market, you can tend to be into a wider variety of activities. You can be in more places around the world, more places, more different types of geological plays, more different types of political arenas, and allows you to diversify your risks, just like you might do with a stock portfolio. Some you might have in tech stocks, some you might have in industrial stocks, some you might have in bonds, some you might have in savings. The same way the oil companies like to diversify their risks by getting into more ventures rather than being concentrated, more highly concentrated in fewer types of ventures. It allows them, their resources and personnel, it allows them to spread them, because in many cases, we'll talk about this in a minute, they're not the operator. They still get a share of the risks and the profits, but they don't necessarily have to put people into each of these operations. They gain geological information by being in more operations around the world, even at a lower equity share. They gain information. Information is key in the upstream sector. So the more different types of geological plays they can gain geophysical and geological data about, the better informed they can be, the more they can fill in the holes in their understanding. And in some cases, governments will actually impose that companies participate in a joint venture. They don't also want to be exposed to the risk that one company will be incompetent or not find sufficient funding, or not being able to find the expertise they need for that specialized type of project. And the basic form in which these companies come together is via the Joint Operating Agreement, or commonly known as the JOA. It establishes an unincorporated joint venture. You won't see a company name associated with this. It's just a group of companies that have agreed on a way to operate. Each partner contributes its share every month of the costs that are needed. Each partner has the right to sell separately their own equity share of the oil or gas that's made available, and to retain those proceeds to themselves. Each partner then has to pay their own share of taxes or royalties on their share. One partner, and this is key, is appointed as operator. We'll talk about what the operator's roles are. But they also, as part of this, the JOA establishes the rules they want to follow for how they make decisions. Is it a majority required, or a unanimity? How are budgets approved? How are contracts approved? How do you, who has priority in terms of selling the products? What kind of notifications do you have to give? And it's important to note that in these joint, unincorporated joint ventures, it is common, matter of fact, typical for the national oil company of the country to be one of those joint venture partners. This is significant because that affects the control and the participation of the country. As I said, one of the companies is appointed as the operator, and they're the one that execute all the contracts in their own name. Even though they're doing it on behalf of the joint venture, they're the one that sign the contracts. They use its own personnel. They have to supply all the personnel. They're the one that spends the money, that tracks the costs. Any amounts that spend is recovered, as I mentioned, through these monthly so-called cash calls they make to the non-operating partners. And the operator is responsible for compliance for all regulations, everything from anti-corruption regulations to environmental regulations to employment and hiring regulations, tax compliances. And they have to, the requirement imposed on them is typically some language that's called, they have to use good oil field practice. What that is and how that's defined can be a subject of debate. And a key part is, strictly in their role as operator, the company cannot make a profit or a loss. So the whole idea is there to be compensated for their costs, but nothing more. They will make profit in their role as a joint venture partner, but not specifically due to their role as the operator. Another form that is used rather than an unincorporated joint venture is the shareholder company. And this is more commonly used in midstream or LNG projects, not the upstream exploration and production as much. Usually this is a separate company that's been incorporated, or it may be a limited liability company. There is a shareholders agreement instead of a joint operating agreement. Similar type of areas it covers, but instead each participant becomes a shareholder. They're actually issued shares in that company. All the companies may second or allocate employees to this company, not just one company. They collect their cash from the shareholders via capital contributions or issuance of shares, or this company may even go out and borrow in its own name. Usually the product is sold jointly. Each company doesn't sell its share separately. And profits, instead of each company in the joint venture, where they put up their share of cash for the costs, they sell their own oil or gas, they pay their own taxes, so therefore anything that's left for them is the profit. In this case, it's all earned together, and those profits are distributed as dividends. So how is the work actually carried out? We've talked about an operator and the operator signing contracts and making spending recommendations and managing bank accounts. But as we talked about in the previous video presentation, the actual work is typically carried out by contractor companies, oil field service companies. And this is just a slide from one of those before. They contract with the operator. They provide specialized techniques, equipment, specialized personnel. It includes everything from seismic activity, seismic surveys, drilling, support vessels, catering, you name it. So these are the ones that are contracted with through a variety of contracts between the operator and those companies. This is just a diagram showing briefly in high level, just for something as simple as drilling a well, how those contracts work. The joint venture operator, under the rights granted to them under the joint operating agreement, contracts with a variety of companies, maybe to look at the subsea soil, maybe to get supply boats, helicopters, get equipment, but usually there's also a drilling rig owner company that they pay to bring in their drilling rig and then to operate it. And even that drilling rig company may on its own subcontract out to a variety of companies, perhaps to do catering on the rig, to perhaps find temporary staff, tugs or barges, telecommunications, the whole thing. So all of these lines can represent individual contracts that may be in place. Looking at it from a little bit bigger picture, there's this somewhat complex diagram here, but it just shows the range of contracts and how they interact in a typical oil and gas venture. So there's quite a few of these. If you look in the center, this is the basic exploration and or exploitation contract, but this is really in many cases the PSA, the Production Sharing Agreement. And then within that you have the joint operating agreement between the parties, and then you have a variety of other agreements with the contractor companies, agreements with perhaps a pipeline company, perhaps an agreement with the state oil company in terms of how they will, some arrangements with them. Perhaps you might have separate subcontracts. You might have a separate agreement that covers how crude oil will be exported and who will do it, what kind of vessels will be allowed into the area. So this is just the agreement part. This doesn't even address the actual laws that may be put in place. So you can see there's not only a lot of laws, some of which conflict with each other or require exemptions or exceptions were granted, and there are agreements, everything from the production sharing agreement to the individual contracts between the companies and the operators and their contractors, and also the joint operating agreement. So what takes precedence? This is just a basic hierarchy that has been established, that this is put out by the National Natural Resources Governance Institute, and it talks about how the constitution of a country tends to be the overriding document, followed by individual legislation or policies they may establish. And then you have regulations, rules, and model contracts. So this would be perhaps where the production sharing agreement would fit in. And then you have individual contracts, which may be between the companies as a joint operating agreement, and also the company's operator and the oil field services companies. So you have all these. In many countries, the law will say which would take precedence over the other. But then, by the same token, agreements like the production sharing agreement may override those, and so it really becomes a legal complexity. Adding on top of that is an additional complexity of international treaties. These are usually in the form of a tax treaty or a investment treaty, and these are conducted at a government-to-government level. And so, for instance, if a U.S. company is operating in, let's say, in Nigeria, and if the Nigerian government and the U.S. government have an investment treaty, it usually spells out certain criteria that if one of their companies is doing business in the other's country, that there's certain rules that would apply, that they be treated fairly, that their investments not be expropriated or nationalized or put at undue risk. But they may also address things like saying they will not discriminate against international employees or contractors, which could mean, in effect, they're giving precedence. They're not allowed to give precedence to their own local companies, so that the Nigerian contractor or Nigerian employee may not be able to be granted some sort of preference in hiring. And this can be a barrier to individual countries implementing their own policies to encourage these type of activities, which are really the meat of how a company or a country can expand benefits beyond purely petroleum production revenues. And these things tend to favor the developed, industrialized countries that are the ones that tend to have more international businesses operating. And so the rise of these kind of investment treaties is quite often not appreciated or understood fully by the host governments. So just looking at a matrix, what controls what? This is confusing. This is complex. And if you look at issues like the mineral rights, they're controlled by both concession or PSA and quite often by the petroleum laws of the country. Sharing of costs and benefits between the companies. Usually it's the joint operating agreement or shareholders agreement that would dictate that. But then if you look at management and control of the operations, it can be anything from the PSA to the joint operating agreement to oil field service contracts. How are those operations managed? How the government gets its revenues, how it gets its taxes or royalties, its production share. The driving document is the concession agreement or PSA, but sometimes the tax laws will come into play. They're referenced in those agreements, or even the general laws of the country can come into play. Which laws apply? Which don't? Which takes precedence, the agreements or the laws? What happens if there's a dispute? Once again, you end up having to refer to a variety of documents to make this determination. Everything from the concession or PSA to the petroleum laws, general laws, a treaty. Even if there's a dispute between the companies and the national oil company, it may be the joint operating agreement that applies. And then virtually every single one of these agreements or even the treaties addresses standards. What's expected of the operation? What laws are they intended to comply with and which are they not? What is the standard for enforcement, for gaining information on their activities, for auditing them, for fines and penalties? So you can understand how companies, which are quite sophisticated legal departments and a lot of expertise around the world, may have somewhat of an advantage over a fairly new country that's new to petroleum in terms of this complex interaction and which agreements apply, which do not, and also how these expectations and these standards and these relationships affect how benefits are derived in the country. Another aspect of this that's somewhat of a problem is that What would the public need to know about this? In the U.S., virtually all of this, except for the JOAs and the agreements between the companies, are public. They're laws. They don't have production sharing agreements. And especially for the large offshore U.S. activities, these are all public documents. But in most countries in the world, since the basic production sharing agreement is not made public because it's an agreement, not a law, and it's up to the country to decide whether they disclose it or not, what do they dictate? Well, in a way, they say the same thing that a law would in many parts of the world. They talk about how they're taxed. They're talked about what laws they're exempt from and which they're not. It establishes certain rules for how they're to behave, how they're to hire locally, how they're to contract, and yet quite often they're not disclosed. So these range of laws, of agreements as opposed to laws, dictate how revenues are collected by the government's role in decisions, what risks the government may take on in the exploration phase or even in issues like cost recovery, environmental protection, local employment, corruption, potential. If these agreements don't have tight rules on how governments should be paid and how those monies are reported, so how else will society evaluate its own government or the performance of an oil company unless it's via comparison to what they were required to do by agreement? But the problem is agreements and contracts are not typically publicly disclosed. There have been a variety of efforts internationally by NGOs and even by some governments to indeed publish these types of contracts. In the U.S., the Dodd-Frank Act was intended to require oil companies to publish the contents of these types of agreements. But some of the NGOs like Open Oil, NRGI, Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, Open Oil, again, the American Institute of Petroleum Negotiators, and have taken upon themselves to locate some of these laws and agreements and publish them online so that they're available to local governments and civil society. The local governments, why is it benefit to them? Because then if they're about to enter into a new agreement, they have some basis for looking, well, how did country A do it? What about country B? How did they do this? How did they handle this particular issue? Oil companies have hundreds of examples they can go to look at for examples for best practices or practices that are most beneficial to them, but governments don't. And so this is part of this mismatch that can create or add to some of the symptoms of the natural resource curse. So having this publicly available information can be a real tool that the companies and the governments and civil society can use. So overall, what are some of the potential problem areas that we see in this whole structure of legal laws, contracts, agreements? For one, think about it. If you're a country new to oil and gas, you're required to put in this whole range of laws, agreements, policies right at the beginning before even any exploration is done. But of course, we know the market can change. We've seen how oil prices have gone up and down. The geology, going into it, maybe no one's ever explored there. All of a sudden, there's a huge discovery. And now, that same sharing of benefits still make sense? Political factors. Maybe people in the country are starting to find out more about oil and gas as the exploration and development process goes on. And maybe the public says, wait a minute, we need to establish a different standard. So these things change over time, but the agreements and the legal structures typically don't. Some cases they can anticipate changes, they can build in progressivity in terms of how much the government takes, but quite often they don't. And so this can create a certain amount of tension between the government and the oil companies and the public, and some instability. Sometimes the companies can make undue amount of profit during this period. Other cases, it means that the companies won't even go ahead with the project just because some particular aspect of the terms discourage that. The role of international treaties is still evolving, as I mentioned. It's a fairly new area. Oil companies are starting to use them in things like litigation or arbitration, and they tend to favor the industrialized countries. As I mentioned, these agreements are all done before the government gains any experience. There's a mismatch of what the industry and the government's expertise and knowledge is. And so the negotiation is not really between equals. And quite often this can lead to problems further down the line. And the critical agreements and the aspects of those agreements are rarely made public. So this just makes it that much easier for a government to not carry out their remit properly. It makes it difficult for the average citizen or civil society to really evaluate the performance of the companies and whether or not the country is getting a good deal or not. So just in summary of the legal and contractual structure, some main points. It's complex. It's a combination of laws and agreements. It's not just one. So you can't just go to one agreement or one law and say, that's what determines it. You have to look at all of them. And it's important when you're analyzing the industry, if you're working in the industry, to recognize this, that there's a complex array here that has to be looked at. These laws, agreements, contracts dictate everything. The rights that the governments and the companies and the communities may have, their relationship, who's responsible for what. If there's a problem with the community, was the government supposed to negotiate that or the company? If there was a spill, to what extent should the company have been responsible for that? To what extent should they say, well, they weren't required to by law to do something about that? If there's a spill, who's required to clean it up and pay for those costs? How are they to be managed? Who's in control? You want the company or the entity with expertise to control, but by the same token, they may have a fairly narrow vision of what is a good operation. The government may say, or the community may say, wait a minute, we want local employment. We want to make sure we're consulted before you go ahead with a project. We want to make sure this isn't going to cause undue traffic or potential for pollution. And these are all dictated by these agreements. And one of the most important aspects, how are the eventual benefits to be shared? How much goes to the company, to the government, to local governments? And how does that change as market and geological conditions change? Quite often these agreements grant exemptions to existing laws or provide incentives to go ahead. And in many cases these are not known, or maybe they're overstated or not necessary or have unintended consequences. So all of this is a factor in how oil and gas, the type of impact it can have on a country, on its overall economic development and diversification, on how much the country actually benefits from oil and gas, and how local communities benefit from oil and gas. Thanks. I hope in conclusion you've been able to gain an appreciation of some of the complexity and the interaction of the various laws and agreements, how that can affect companies, governments, and communities, and some of the areas of problems that can be created through these laws and agreements, and how the overall picture of the structure of the industry works.